It may be one of your best. Quite strong. Like,
certainly was not.
We obviously came out with that picture, but from that back,
And you're one of the few groups that's supporting it.
yeah.
That's my friend.
Like, it is for me. That was I think like things like that.
Although, you know, they were opposed to
I get to be
this is not.
yeah. Right. But I think there's also like we like the Harker Bell, this is okay. Sometimes I think over things is great.
Sure. That's what I think. This is a way how you just from a strange perspective.
Oh yeah.
Actual ones.
Which like it's like when yes.
So, how do you do? Which one? So you just ran your cell phone, punch the button, Ustream. Is it a pay service? Is it free?
It's free. It's on Eyes on Richmond Network.
Eyes of Richmond?
Eyes on Richmond.
Eyes on Richmond. Can they hear us right now as we speak?
Yep.
Hi, Eyes on Richmond. What a great idea. I love modern technology. I just can't keep up with this too bad. And actually, we're ready to work at
Oh, is that right?
it.
You say your possibility. A slight tactical error.
But I'm sure they will. It's one of those things that's moving pretty quick.
And like,
Exactly. You know, that's the thing. It's not
right.
so go to the like this was a lose-lose strategy. This strategy, other is lost.
I call the meeting to order. Let me just lay down a couple of ground rules before we start. It's a small room and it's very crowded. And so I would ask you to behave in an adult manner in here. You're welcome to speak when your opportunity comes up. So we're not going to allow 10 or 12 people to speak on the same topic. So if there are groups of you here for one of the bills, I would suggest that you select a spokesman for your group. We have 15 bills on the docket, and we intend to get through all of them today. This is our last day to get through them. The other thing is, I saw some signs. Don't wave your signs in here. We have too many people, and it's just not appropriate to do that in here. And if you do, then I will ask you to leave. So we're going to take the bills probably in no particular order, just as the patrons are here. That's all we can do because there are meetings going on all over this building. And so we'll work through it the best we can. They'll get Pope. Pope. Okay, they'll get photographed. When you're ready, Joey.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee. Before you, you have HB 2205. It probably looks familiar because it should anyway. What this bill does, it would require the high school family life education curriculum that's offered by the local school division to incorporate age-appropriate, evidence-based curricula focused on with the law and the meaning of consent. And this bill actually passed in this body and all of you seated around this table actually supported this in 2017. Unfortunately, the Senate had a different idea and changed the language to make it permissive. And so bringing this language back Specifically, you might recall, we discussed the specific language of this as it relates to then Delegate Dave Albo, who had some suggestions for some of the language, specifically the law and the meaning of consent. And again, we're talking about educating, providing an opportunity in an age-appropriate, evidence-based curricula as it relates to teaching law and the meaning of consent. And I think what we have found, and obviously this was several years ago, there's been countless instances where behavior could have been changed and altered had there been some education in an age-appropriate manner. And so I hope it'll be the will of this body to pass this bill. And I appreciate your support. There's many people here to speak in support of this bill. We've been working with many organizations. We've been working with the DEA. We've been working with educators. We've been working with the Sexual Violence Alliance, and I believe they're here as well, and also possibly the school boards.
And thank you. Are there questions for the patron from subcommittee members? This is really not new to us. We saw this bill identical to this, right? 2 years ago, and passed it out of the House. So it's the same bill back, and we'll give the Senate a chance to redeem themselves. Is there anyone in the audience who wishes to speak to the bill? We have heard this bill a lot. So if you want to just identify yourself and tell us whether you support it or not, it'll be great. And if you would mind coming to the podium to do that.
Hello, sir. Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman. Jonathan Iglesias with the Virginia Sexual and Domestic Violence Action Alliance. I will keep it brief and just say that we support this bill, and 20 plus years actually, best practices in public health and public health science tell us that this is the best way to curb the epidemic of sexual assault. Getting to young folks in an evidence-informed way, early, often, and making sure that they have access to the information that they need. So we support this bill.
Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, I'm Kathy Bircher with the Virginia Education Association, and we support the bill.
Thank you. Anyone else? Is there anyone opposed to the bill? Chair will entertain a motion.
Report, Mr. Chairman.
Second. We have a motion properly moved and seconded to report the bill. Is there further discussion? Hearing none, please cast your vote. That bill is recommended for reporting on 5-0 vote. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee.
Lance, I think you have a bill for us. Maybe question courtesy.
You all considered this at your last meeting, and Ryan has a substitute which I think addresses what I heard from the subcommittee and others that had raised some concerns. House Bill 2338.
Bring your attention to House Bill 2338.
Mr. Chairman, you would recall that the legislation was somewhat broad when I brought it to you before, related to restoring some SOL requirements, and I've got a lot of information from folks. The main concern that I had, which is a little different than Senator Newman, who was trying to accomplish the same thing but maybe in a little broader term with some additional items, is to require that we basically reinstitute the Virginia and U.S. history SOL requirement. And that's what this substitute simply does. It doesn't do any more, it doesn't do any less. And the reason being is, as a member of the Commission on Civics Education, and from discussions that the Board of Education's been having, with having removed that requirement, there's been raised a concern that our young people are not getting the basics that they would if we had the SOL requirement reinstituted on Virginia and U.S. history, which are two, I think, very important aspects of learning for our young people. so what we're attempting to do is just reinstitute that, try to do it as narrowly as possible so we're not encompassing some of the other areas that Senator Newman, I think, envisioned. The department helped me basically make sure we tailored this to just accomplish that. So that's what I'm attempting to do. And I believe I mentioned, we'll just reiterate, I've gotten contacts from lots of individuals related to social studies and history that they believe this is very important that we do. Given the fact we've tried to scale back SOL requirements, I've supported that. This is one I do think we need to reinstitute and would be beneficial to our students.
Thank you, Dr. Landis. Are there questions from subcommittee members for Patriot? Anyone in the audience wish to speak to the bill, for or against? Yes, ma'am.
Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, Laurie McCullough with the Virginia Association of Supervision and Curriculum Development. Although we continue to have concerns about any one single test that creates a barrier to graduation, we think these changes to the bill make it much better, and we appreciate the changes. Thank you.
Thank you.
Mr. Chair, member of the committee, Tom Smith, Superintendent Association. I want to associate my comments with Dr. McCullough. We do have some concerns, our membership does, with regard to one test like this for history, but we do tremendously appreciate the patron in making some changes and making this a better bill. Thank you.
Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, Stacey Haney on behalf of the Virginia School Board Association. I would just echo the comments of the prior two speakers. We think this is a vast improvement over the introduced bill. We do have a concern with one test being a barrier to graduation for some students, particularly English language learners, that this might be a barrier to graduation for them, but we understand where the delegate's going, and we certainly appreciate the amendments that have been made.
Thank you. Anyone else wish to speak to the bill? Chair, we can a motion. Report.
I'd ask a question because I'm trying to think back to the actions we took with taking verified credits out and removing some of the SOL tests. I guess there's a couple different ways to go ahead and approach this because we do have SOL test requirements for reading and writing and science that are in there. And so is there a reason why we made this one a verified credit that was above and beyond what's required for those? And so we've actually, if I understand it, kind of bifurcated where we've got one standard for those very, very important things, and then we've put this at the apex as a potential barrier test. I'm just wondering if there's a reason why we didn't simply put this back in line with some of those other SOL tests.
Mr. Chairman, I'd say, Doug, that the attempt was to try to track the language that we originally had in the bill that Senator Newman was working on, but then just narrow the scope to Virginia history and U.S. history. I understand some of those concerns, but I think the discussions the board has had is that Virginia and U.S. history of such an importance that we wanted to treat them somewhat differently than we have other subject matters. And
House Bill 2382, which seeks to protect the freedom of student journalists and further codifies definitions of school-sponsored media, student journalists, student media advisors, and gives student media advisors also protections in the classroom. The reason why we need this bill is that we have seen an increasing number of censorship cases in the Commonwealth, and there are a lot of people who came here today to share their own personal stories of how they have been censored, they felt unnecessarily by administrators. Where we are at is that in 1988 there was a U.S. Supreme Court decision, the Hazelwood decision, that basically said that administrators, principals, as long as they have a legitimate interest in wanting to censor something in a school newspaper or school-sponsored activity, that they are able to do so. That they don't need to have any real justification or cause, that as long as they are interested in seeing that censorship occur, that they are allowed to do it. What this bill does is restores Virginia back to a posture of where we were prior to that decision under a different Supreme Court case, the Tinker Standard, which says that you need to show material and substantial disruption of the orderly operation of the school and have legitimate facts to back that up that would make that assertion viable in order for you to censor some article, opinion piece, or production that would be occurring in school-sponsored media. So I think, as you'll see, it amends both Title 22 and 23, defines school-sponsored media, student journalist, student media advisor, protects what a student journalist has a right to exercise as freedom of speech or the press in school-sponsored media, but then also allows for school boards to still have freedom to censor information, articles, and things that are created as part of school-sponsored media if they can satisfy any of the 4 elements of subsection D. And so because there are a lot of people who want to speak about this bill, Mr. Chairman, I will shut up now and entertain any questions from the subcommittee.
Are there questions for the paper subcommittee? Hearing none. Is there anyone who would like to speak in favor of the bill?
Good afternoon. My name is Kate Carstens. I'm here in support of HB 2382. I'm 19 years old. I was born and raised in the city of Falls Church, and my parents live in Arlington County. It's been nearly 2 years since I left my hometown to attend university.
Folks, I'm not gonna hear from all of you. Time won't allow it, so pick 2 others besides this young lady, and we'll hear from them. That's how we do it.
Mr. Chairman, I do have written testimony that may be able to be furnished to the subcommittee and to other members of the full committee. We also made sure, thinking that this would be possible, to have written testimony as well.
Why don't you pass that out?
Sure. I don't have individual copies of everybody, but
Yes, I'm sorry.
Like I said, it's been almost 2 years since I left my hometown to attend the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill and join the staff at Tar Heel, where I have reported on a Confederate statue being torn down in the middle of the night, a chancellor's resignation, students who resort to stripping to pay for student fees. But none of these stories could have been written under policies like the one I faced in Falls Church. Without bills like 2382, school districts introduce policies specifically designed to restrain student journalists. The policy allows the principal, at his sole discretion, to promote his view of what our school should publish and how it should be represented, which in practice often strays far from reality. During the 4 years I worked and edited The Lasso, our bathrooms were repeatedly vandalized, school absence policies were abused, and the sexting scandal shook our middle school. As student journalists, we were perfectly positioned to report on these stories and separate fact from rumors. Instead, The Lasso was censored when we attempted to cover the vandalism and policy abuse, and we didn't even attempt to cover the sexting scandal because we knew we would be censored. Does this sound like accountability? Does this sound like democracy? I don't want to see any more high school students sit through political science classes talking about the Bill of Rights when we have our same values stripped when we attempt to report on school news. The irony is mad. Each successive level of education aims to prepare its students for life afterward. When high schools teach their students to shy away from controversy and adjust to censorship, they fail to prepare students for the responsibility that awaits them. Students report on the complex issues that administrators, time and time again, claim is beyond their maturity level. HB 2382 is crucial to ensure that the newest generation of students in our state will know and understand the responsibility of what it means to be an American citizen. Thank you.
Thank you.
Is Kate LaRue? Okay, please. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Kathleen LaRue and I live in Virginia Beach, Virginia. 8 years ago, I was the journalism teacher at Madison County High School, where my students had their papers shut down, and I was removed as advisor when my students wrote an article about renovating the school building, and it was censored by our school's principal and the division superintendent. In our spring 2011 issue, the students wanted to write an opinion piece about how their high school needed a makeover. They interviewed numerous teachers and students about why the building needed to be renovated or even rebuilt. They consulted a document provided by architects who looked over the building to advise the school board on improvements, quoting from it in the piece. All issues of the paper had to be read by the principal before it could go to print. He didn't like the opinion piece and he made a few changes, but I advocated that it was factually correct. The principal allowed the newspaper to be printed and distributed. After it was published, the superintendent was livid that students had written anything negative about the building. The superintendent and principal ordered me to remove the issue online and destroy all existing copies. Before the school year was out, the school's principal removed me as the advisor of the newspaper, and he ordered that the last issue of the paper be read by the entire English department. The class was then canceled, and to this day it is referred to as a desktop publishing class with journalism skills included. I was called in during the summer and was informed that I would no longer be teaching at the high school, and I would instead be teaching at the new alternative high school to be located in an unused elementary school gym, where I would be teaching students who were in trouble and couldn't attend the normal high school. So a sort of one-room schoolhouse sort of a scenario. I ended up applying for any job I could find and was thankful that Tallwood High School in Virginia Beach employed me so I did not have to teach in Madison anymore. If HB 2382, the bill you are contemplating, had existed 8 years ago, my story would have had a very different ending. What my students experienced was traumatic and cynical. They did nothing wrong, but were silenced. They should have been allowed to voice their informed, constructive opinion about the conditions in their school. The superintendent bullied me and intimidated my students into silence about an issue that had been public knowledge and should never have been censored. Ultimately, the system silenced them, killed the newspaper, and forced me to leave the district. These are the wrong lessons to teach young people whom we are preparing to become thoughtful, well-informed, and civically engaged Americans. I respectfully ask for the passage of Delegate Hurst's bill, HB 2382. Thank you.
Thank you. One more.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Members of the committee, I appreciate this opportunity to share a few minutes with you. My name is Frank Lamonti. I'm a media law professor down at the University of Florida, although I'm here on my own, not speaking for my institution. I'm here at Delegate Hurst's invitation to share with you the benefit of the 10 years that I spent running the Student Press Law Center up in Washington, D.C., where I dealt with these statutes on an everyday basis and saw them operating in action. House Bill 2382 is what's called a New Voices Law. These give students a very modest degree of press freedom that in no way approaches the Washington Post or Wall Street Journal level of protection. These laws are on the books in 14 states, including Maryland, with a combined history of 180 years of experience among them. More than 1/3 of all the high school students in America today have the benefit of New Voices protection, so there is nothing that's risky or unproven or experimental about these laws. Although school authorities typically oppose these laws, because after all, more authority is always better than less, they very quickly acclimate to them. Why? Because all that the bill does is protect against what we call making the school look bad censorship, the image-motivated censorship that keeps students from having a voice on the issues of social and political concern that they care about. It leaves absolutely undisturbed the ability of a school to remove anything that is harmful, dangerous, legally actionable, or disruptive. And that disruption standard is very important. You heard the sponsor talk about the Tinker standard. Tinker has been the law of the land for 50 years, and the disruption standard is pulled straight from the Supreme Court Tinker opinion. It is the law that today governs all other student speech in schools other than the newspaper, which is on an unprotected plateau. What this bill does is square up the protection of a journalistic publication with all other speech: t-shirts, baseball caps, flyers, leaflets, posters. So anything that a school could stop you from saying on a t-shirt or ball cap, they can stop you from saying in a newspaper. It just puts those on the same legal plane, and it's a plane that schools are very comfortable with because they have 50 years of legal precedent. Now, why are these laws passing all over the country with unanimous bipartisan support? I'll give you 3 reasons, and I'll be happy to take your questions. First, you just heard a bill presented today about civic engagement. We're all concerned that young people are graduating unprepared to have full participation in the democracy that they are about to inherit. And Hazelwood's censorship is civic disengagement in action. It sends the message to young people that they are bad citizens if they question the government or advocate for better quality government services. No message could be more civically toxic. Just share with you one statistic. You have my written testimony. Student journalists were surveyed in North Carolina. Fully 1/3 of them came back and said that they were categorically forbidden from speaking about the existence of illegal drugs in student media at a time when illegal drugs are killing more of our young people than suicide or automobile accidents or any other cause. That is educational malpractice to adhere to that level of control. Secondly,
Sir, could I ask you to wrap up, please?
I sure will. You're all concerned about the declining regard for the First Amendment on our college campuses. Where do we think students learn to devalue the First Amendment? When they see it devalued in front of their eyes in their K-12 lives. And finally, Hazelwood is a relic of the time before social media, when we could protect students from learning about teen pregnancy by tearing pages out of paper newspapers. But that's not the world we live in anymore. And when we drive the discussion of social and political issues out of the newsroom and onto social media, students aren't required to check their facts, verify their sources, sign their real names, correct their mistakes, or do any of the other skills and values and ethics of journalism, and they do it without any adult supervision at all. Journalism is a solution for schools. It's not a problem, and New Voices recognizes this new reality. Thank you.
Thank you. If you are here in support of this bill, if you wish to associate yourself with the remarks, would you please stand up? Okay, thank you. Is there opposition to the bill?
Mr. Chairman, Stacey Haney on behalf of the Virginia School Board Association. We do have some serious concerns with the bill. We heard a good deal about the Tinker standard, which this bill would embody in the law. But you have to remember, and many of you may be familiar with the Tinker case, Tinker didn't involve school-sponsored speech. Tinker was the case about the students during the Vietnam War that wore the black armbands to school in a silent protest. And so what this bill does is take a concept that was meant to apply to student speech and apply it to school-sponsored speech. And so I would suggest to you that that is the wrong standard to apply to school-sponsored speech. So your school newspaper, your school publications, these are publications that are sponsored by the school that are seen as communications coming from the school. And so to take away the school, or ultimately the school board's authority to have a say over what is included in those publications that are school-sponsored is the wrong, absolutely the wrong way to go. And the last thing I'll point out, Mr. Chairman, because I know there's some other folks who want to speak, is that if there's an issue in a community, as some of the speakers mentioned, if there's an issue in a community, the best place to address that is with the locally elected, in almost all cases, school board, to take that issue to the local school board if citizens aren't happy with the way that a publication is being handled in their local division. So I would suggest that that's the best place to address these problems. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, Tom Smith, Superintendent Association. I want to follow up with what Ms. Haney said and agree. The other thing you've got to remember, we heard a lot about what colleges let you do as compared to what high schools let you do. There are many instances in the code in which they treat college students or post-secondary students different than they do in high school. We're not talking about an 18 or a 19-year-old. We're talking about possibly a 14 or 15-year-old writing a story. So we oppose it. We feel it is a step too far, and would ask that it not go forward. Thank you.
Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, members of the subcommittee, Bette Neal, representing middle and high school principals. And as we discussed with the patron, and thank you so much for hearing our concerns, we are concerned, number one, as you have heard, these are students. They need support, they need supervision, and they're pretty doggone smart. You've heard some really good journalists here. But these are students who are learning about the techniques of journalism. They are not journalists per se. We support all of our students in all of our courses. This is a course. Thank you.
In the interest of fairness, that's 3 speakers on each side, so I would ask Anyone in opposition, please stand. Okay. Thank you. Any further questions from the subcommittee? Councilman Davis.
Mr. Chairman, the last speaker, the attorney, if you wouldn't mind, back to the podium, so I just have a question for him.
He can answer his hand.
Oh, yes. Didn't know if someone else was up there.
Yes.
So not to mean harm to the bill at all, because I've talked to the patron, I like it, but looking at C, and these are the exemptions. And under that, under C4, you talk about the material substantial disruption or the orderly operation of the school. And my only concern with this, and I was expressed to the patron, is does that get a little bit ambiguous because there's almost an would a principal or whatever expect, and if they expect, then they can shut it down. And given where political speech is today, sometimes you don't have to do a whole heck of a lot to have so-called disruption. Would taking that piece out at the very end of 4, can we legally do that, or would we be in violation of whatever law cases we're trying to kind of get back to?
Sure, well, thanks for that question. So when the Supreme Court speaks, as they did in Hazelwood and as they did in Tinker, they're just setting a floor and not a ceiling. So a state is certainly free to deviate above that level of protection. They just cannot go below. So certainly if the committee decided that that's not the right place to draw the line, you can go higher. I think the rationale for that substantial disruption standard, to the concerns that you heard from the school folks, is the whole idea, the reason that the Supreme Court crafted that standard in Tinker was to allow some elbow room for local decision making so that people could make really flexible decisions based on conditions in their school. I mean, just a quick example. So suppose the students in one high school want to do a crimson cover on their yearbook. They want to use the color crimson. Well, in 99 out of 100 schools, there's no problem with that. But if a principal says that, oh, that's a gang color, and in my school we're having gang warfare right now, and so you cannot use crimson on that cover, well, then the principal gets to make that decision. And the principal gets to say, look, I know that's not usually disruptive, but in this particular case, under our local conditions, it would be, and I overrule you. So that's the kind of situation it's meant for.
Thank you.
I have a question to John out there as well, and I guess I have less of a problem with respect to college and university students, as was mentioned earlier, in terms of applying Tinker to that. My concern is much more along the lines of applying that same standard to high school, and if I understand it, it's also elementary schools in this particular case. And so I guess my question is this, so with respect to family life education curriculum, we are very careful to ensure that as we roll that out, that we do that in an age-appropriate manner, because family life education for a 4th grader versus a 6th grader versus an 8th grader versus a senior is going to be different. We're going to be able to absorb things differently. And so my concern is something very well may be factually accurate, very well may be true, but it very well may not be age appropriate depending on when and how it's delivered and at what grade level. And so my question is, does the Tinker standard allow you to take that into consideration, or would an elementary school or a middle school or a high school be stuck having to accept something because it was factually true?
Well, first of all, I guess I should say I'm not aware, and I've been doing this for a long time, of any elementary school newspapers to speak of, and certainly I've never taken a phone call about a censorship case at elementary schools. I think that's kind of that is not a really operative part of the statute. But let's go. Right. I mean, it's not one that's likely to be put to the test very often, given the infrequency with which schools have those publications. But going higher up, I think the answer is there's always room in that substantial disruption standard, just as there is, again, for T-shirts, ball caps, or leaflets, or anything else, for a school to make a circumstance-specific judgment. So yes, there are cases applying the Tinker standard, including here in the 4th Circuit where you reside, that say that if it is decided that this particular speech is going to provoke a disruptive reaction, right? Not just that it may address a controversial issue, but it will actually cause people to act out in a way that interferes with the ability of teachers to teach, then that is speech that could be stopped. I guess I should also say, one thing the bill does is it recognizes that the teacher has the ability to teach standards and practices of good journalism, and that grade book is really quite powerful. And I think, I'm sorry that the other teachers didn't get a chance to be heard, but I think they'll tell you that the way that the work flows, right, is that the teacher would look at the article and the teacher would say, look, I think this has got 5 things wrong with it, and would say, look, you're going to get a D on this article if you don't fix the 5 things, and that grade book really solves a lot of your problems right there, and nothing in the, well, at all interferes with the ability of the teacher to say, look, this is a poor article that's not suitable for our publication, and I'm going to give you that grade for it. So a lot of that stuff will take care of itself in that interaction process between the teacher and the student.
Any further questions? Subcommittee members? Chair will entertain a motion.
Move the report.
We have a motion properly seconded to recommend the reporting of the bill. Some further discussion? Hearing none, please cast your vote. That motion fails on a 3-3 vote.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the subcommittee.
Go ahead. Delegate Pope.
Bill 2508, all it does is it expands the types of support positions to include licensed behavior analysts or assistant licensed behavior analysts that schools could hire under the topic of health and behavioral positions. It doesn't cost the schools anything, it's not mandatory, and it just expands their options when hiring support positions. I do have 2 people that would like to testify in favor of it.
Okay, let me see if the subcommittee members have any questions for you. Any none. Is anyone who would like to speak to the bill?
My name is Christine Danka. I'm the Administrative Director for the Virginia Association for Behavior Analysis, and we are in support of the bill and are happy to answer any questions that you have for us.
Anyone else wish to speak to the bill?
Good afternoon. My name is Candace Lucas. I'm with Advocate for Equity in Schools. We work with underserved populations, specifically students with disabilities. We are definitely in support of this bill. This is probably one of the most single steps that school divisions can take to dismantle the preschool to prison pipeline. Thank you.
Anyone else wish to speak to the bill?
Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, I'm Kathy Bircher with the Virginia Education Association. We support the bill.
Hi, Becky Bowers O'Meara with CA Human Services Organization, which used to be Commonwealth Autism, and we are in support of it.
Okay. Is there any opposition to the bill? Delegate Pope.
That the hiring of licensed behavior analysts or assistant behavior analysts could save schools money as well, because sometimes they charge less than the other options.
Any further questions from subcommittee members? Let me tell you that Delegate Pogue's bill has been invited to appropriations for the speaker's letter. So, if we act favorably, it would be to report and refer.
So only the reporter would.
Second. I have a motion properly seconded to report and refer the bill to appropriations. Is there further discussion? Hearing none, please cast your vote. Everyone voted? Oh, she tried to. Okay, that motion carries 6-0. The report is referred. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Bill 2520, and I do have a substitute that I'm sure we're passing around. I'll give you a moment to look at that. While you're looking at it, I can just go through why I'm introducing 2520.
Let's get the, canvas.
Okay, I'm sorry.
Without objection, yes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My son Cedric is 21 years old, and he is not a traditional learner. He is neurodiverse. He's a child with also learning disabilities, or young adult now. As a mother, preparing him from school has been one of my most challenging difficulties, especially learning how to navigate not only his education curriculum, but what he was going to do once he graduated from high school. And this is kind of the spirit of where this bill has derived. The school did everything it could to support him in his learning disabilities or his educational challenges. And the high school also offered dual enrollment, but because Cedric didn't fall in the academic criteria to take advantage of that, he was unable to go to college, get some supportive services, and kind of do that dual enrollment and take advantage of some opportunities. Once he got to college, and he was currently in college this past semester, he failed every college course but his technical courses, which is, the irony of that is, technical courses has both math, English, and science combined. But he couldn't adapt to the college curriculum and the pace because of the rate at which the teachers taught it. He didn't get supported. His IEP does not carry over from high school to college. Some portions did, but it was a very light version of the IEP. And he started, because of his high functioning capabilities, he also fell into the gray area in his education. So education equity is really important, as I've had this experience through not only grade school, high school, but his post-secondary. And education is also, as we all know, the equalizer. We know the trends in transforming our economy, preparing our students for the 21st century, and most of these jobs do require either certifications or post-secondary school education. But it's never been, in Virginia today, it's never been a better time to have the right skills and a worse time to have the wrong skills. So Cedric falls into this category. 2520, essentially, is being introduced, let me find my space here, and I apologize here, in the spirit of his challenges. This committee, or advisory committee, is being formed to get leaders and constituents to help advise on possible opportunities or strategies, systems of pathway for children like my son to implement. They could help determine priorities, they can oversee design courses, if that was to be the goal of the committee. They could work with higher education systems, and perhaps more importantly, recruit employers participating in offering meaningful workplace learning for students. I do have some speakers here today in support of the bill, but for children that fall in this neurodiverse spectrum, either because of their disabilities or economically disadvantaged, are also an issue and concern, and I actually fell into both for a very long time. So Cedric was impacted on both ends. One more point, in 2014, 62% of white students received an advanced diploma, 39% were African American, and 40% of Latino students. These gaps persist also in college. So these are the considerations that this advisory committee could take upon and just advise the Secretary of Education on opportunities to close the gap on equity. I did, side note, talk it over with the administration and get their advice and input on this, hence you'll see some of that in that substitution, and the substitutes that I presented. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Any questions for the patron from subcommittee members? Anyone in the audience that wishes to speak to the bill?
Hi there, I'm Philip Lovell. I'm with the Alliance for Excellent Education. We're a national
policy organization dedicated to ensuring that all kids graduate from high school, college, and career ready. I know many in the room are parents, and many of us have received the questions from our kids, why am I learning this? And the purpose of this bill, or the outcomes of this bill, will be to help to answer that question. And high schools across the country, they have an easier time with that question because the education the students receive is better aligned with what's actually happening in the real world. So take, for example, students who in the morning might study biology and learning about how the heart works. And then that afternoon, they go to their internship at the local hospital where they're performing echocardiograms. So they're getting a real flavor of what the real world means and how it relates to their education, and they know why they're learning what they're learning. This is important because there's a disconnect between our education system and our economic system. Today, we need a higher level of education than we ever have in the nation's history. Since the Great Recession, 99% of new jobs have required at least some post-secondary education. In Virginia, the 25 highest paying jobs require at least some post-secondary education. HB 2520 will set up a committee that will help to provide recommendations and a strategy for integrating things like CTE, career and technical education, with academics, with work-based learning, providing kids the opportunity to do paid internships, so, and better align what's happening in high school with what's happening in higher education. We appreciate your consideration and encourage you to adopt the bill. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good afternoon. Once again, my name is Candace Lucas with Advocates for Equity in Schools, and we're appreciative of this bill specifically because it is intentional regarding developing pathways and alternatives for our students that are generally underserved within the academic setting. There's another aspect in which I think that we generally overlook is preparing our children to be entrepreneurs. And that does apply to our children of color, our children with disabilities, and those are options that we want to explore so that our kids do not fail out of school. And as we know, children start to fail out as early as 8th grade. So making sure that these intentional options are available to our children and exposed to them, they're exposed to it repeatedly so that they do not succumb to dropping out is imperative. So we're in support of this bill.
Thank you. Anyone else wish to speak to the bill? Doug, I think the bill, there are lots of things I like about it. I am a little bit concerned about establishing a 21-member steering committee. I think that's not, I don't know if that would serve you well or not, but that's my concern. Doug,
Mr. Chairman, if I could, because over the late summer and fall, I had a chance to participate on the Virginia's for Learners Advisory Committee that Secretary Lane had put together, and it focused in on a lot of these very same issues. I think the telling thing, because they just released the final report a couple weeks ago, was how much more work there is to do. And so we were just able to kind of skim the surface with regard to goals and objectives and what it is that Virginia ought to do in this area. And so I think a steering committee like this can go ahead and make sure we take that good work and ensure that it can be implemented by the General Assembly as well as by the Board of Education and the department. So I think it would be very useful.
Thank you, Doug. Any other questions, Doug Davis?
So I kind of share your concerns. I really appreciate where the delegates coming from. I think we need something similar. My concerns are who those 21 members are. It's no secret I have a problem with K-12 education right now, especially when it comes to our diploma. And so I look at this makeup, and if we're looking at creating opportunities through other alternative routes, especially CTE, I think we have the wrong consistency on these 21 members, because I'm looking at this, and I've got no CTE specific people on there. I've only got 2 members from the business community, a whole bunch from the academic departments, I would say, that in some cases, as we saw, well, I guess last week, a lot of self-preservation going on to the status quo. So my concern would be that while I applaud where we want to get, I don't think this body makeup is going to get us there. I think it's going to be a very slow-moving, protect the status quo type entity. Even when you talk about the standard diploma becoming the default diploma, I agree, but not the standard diplomas we have today. Unfortunately, those with dyslexia have a harder time understanding or being able to learn foreign languages, but we don't allow them to account for that. We said you can't do it too bad, you're gonna get a regular diploma because you're not advanced. Even if they take advanced robotics, additionally, there's no allotment in here to look at changing that advanced diploma for additional pathways. So while I applaud the end game, I think we need some work with this, Mr. Chairman, that we actually have a makeup to get up to the end game that I think the delegate would like to achieve.
I think if I may, Mr. Chairman,
Yes.
just to address some of your concerns, I think, yes, there's probably opportunity to talk about these very issues within the steering committee. You have to start somewhere. If we're not planting the seeds, and as this new speaker, she so eloquently said, we have to be intentional about the starting point. This is, of course, no bill that I can see is always a perfect bill in its initial conception. But I think having these stakeholders who have an investment in education, and then we have stakeholders coming to the table talking about the disadvantages that exist. You had a delegation this summer, an equity education summit, if you will, of over, 700 attendees, and we still have not really come to an ideal of how we're going to address the inequities in education. If we don't act now, then when are we gonna act? How are we gonna take steps towards having these discussions and lifting up the hood of the trunk and saying, hey, look, these are the things that we don't like, and these are steps that we can do to do better. And I think that's part of their strategic plan. What I did also converse with the Secretary of Education was I'd like the reporting back, a copy of the reporting on some of those statistics on equity. And he was very, Secretary Carney was very passionate about equity, but I think this will provide a mechanism or a platform to begin those very discussions that you're referring to.
Sure. Question for Delegate Davis. Delegate Davis, how far do you think the patrons off on those?
Mr. Chairman, I would say that of the 21 members, if we want to get to the end game that the delegate's speaking to, I think we probably need representation from those whose children, like the delegate, are going through alternative education processes, maybe some from the alternative community. Also, more representation from the manufacturing space and the CTE space, ultimately, because that's what we're trying to address here is equity in this, and right now I just see kind of a makeup inside of this that will protect the status quo.
Mr. Chairman, I hope that it will be the will of the committee to move this bill forward, and maybe it's a possibility that Delegate Davis and Delegate Ayala can work together to maybe move some of those around a little bit to see if they can come to some conclusion on those.
Any further questions from the subcommittee?
I like your bill. I don't know what it is, but.
Have a motion to report. Second. And a second.
Yes.
Any further discussion? Please cast your vote. Sorry to see the bad guy.
I know we amended it, so does that include the report?
Yes, yeah, I did take that.
It's noted. Thank you. I will change it.
I did take that.
Sorry about that.
Okay, that motion carries. Thank you, Delegate. Delegate Stickles.
Thank you.
Today I passed out to you in session the briefing of this bill and what the substitute looks like. I gave you a copy of the substitute so you could read it before you gave me the day. We had this tragic accident in my district that took the life of a 9-year-old boy. Unfortunately, this kind of thing has happened before. It's extraordinarily rare, of course, but here's one that happened in 91, one that happened in 73, one that happened in 2001. And so, we need, this is a simple bill that says these dangerous dividers that are in a lot of our schools need to have technology applied to them that will prevent this kind of thing from occurring, or have no students in the building when the operation takes place. One of our news channels, which is here today, has been doing a lot of investigatory work around the metropolitan region and the three-state region, and has found out that there's a lot to be desired in our policies, and they all vary, and they vary within our Virginia school systems. So anyway, the substitute is pretty simple. I think I already explained it, but it says no school employee shall open or close an electronic room partition in any school building when any student is present in such building unless partition includes a safety sensor that automatically stops a partition when a body passes between the leading edge and a wall, an opposing partition, or the stacking area, and that it become indeed part of the regular safety training and reviews that go on in every school, and that the Board of Education shall make model safety guidance regulation for the operation of these dangerous, very dangerous, powerful motorized doors. And there are several people here to speak to the bill, Mr. Chairman.
Questions for the patron from the subcommittee? Young Davis.
Delegate, just trying to envision these sensors. I mean, are we thinking these sensors are almost as simple as what we have on our garage doors, for example? That they may come down, but if something goes underneath them, they automatically stop? Just, it really is something that simple that we can have put on them?
I have heard different estimates on what you'd need for doors of this sizes, from $3,000 to $6,000. But I'm not an expert. There may be someone here today that can give you a better estimate of what they might be. You would think that it wouldn't cost that much, and hopefully, when purchasing walls like this in the future, that they will be built into the original procurement. So this bill does not require retrofitting, but it requires no kid to be in the building when they are operated. That's what it requires. So I think that might be the option that most people would take, but it's not out of the realm of the feasible to spend $6,000 for safety purposes if you have to open and close it all day long, particularly in a gymnasium.
Okay. Thank you.
Anyone else have a question for the patron? Is there anyone in the audience who would like to speak in favor of the bill? Yes, ma'am.
Good afternoon. My name is Sally Devendorf, and I'm Wesley LePicky's grandmother. I'm here to ask for your support for House Bill 1753. I wrote to each of you previously, so I'm not going to repeat myself. In the Northern Virginia area alone, according to NBC News 4, there are 202 electronic partitions in schools. Surely there are just as many or more in the remainder of Virginia. A survey of the Northern Virginia school districts in May, following the 2018 tragedy that resulted in Wesley's death, showed that the vast majority of these school districts included no written policy for electronic partition use, and only one had safety sensors. Unfortunately, when questioned again 6 months later in January, many still had no formal written policies on the use of these partitions, and very few of them even had plans to add sensors. It does not seem that we can depend on school district administrations or school boards to voluntarily act adequately to protect our students. I'm leaving some of this out now in the interest of brevity. Training is absolutely necessary for any staff member who will be operating the partitions. And prohibitions and regulations can greatly reduce, but do not eliminate, the danger. New York State had similar requirements following the first partition death in the state, but another one still occurred. Why? Because the policy wasn't followed. And the partitions without safety sensors killed again. Clearly, safety sensors would best protect children, even against the careless behavior of adults. But Delegate Sickles' bill provides an option. In addition to uniform mandatory training prescribed by the school board, House Bill 1753 adds an important provision. It prohibits operation of the partitions when children are present anywhere in the building, unless safety sensors are installed. Such restrictions, if followed, would virtually eliminate incidents involving children. I commend Delegate Sickles for researching and submitting this bill. It requires, by Virginia state law, that all school districts establish and follow regulations for the operation of electronic partitions, and provides extensive training for all adults operating the partitions, as well as prohibits operation of the partitions when children are present in the building and safety sensors are not installed on the equipment. It will no longer be a voluntary issue. Ladies and gentlemen, we need this bill. Wesley's death was not an isolated incident. There's no requirement for incidents involving electronic partitions to be reported. So it's hard for the Consumer Product Safety Commission to investigate, but they are investigating. Numerous incidents have been discovered. Please, help stop these tragedies from occurring in our schools. Pass House Bill 1753. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hello, everyone. Wow, that was extremely emotional. Delegate Sickles, I'm Kathy Cole. Nice to meet you face to face, sir. I'm gonna cut down what I wrote here, and I do have a statement from Congressman King in support of this bill and some possible funding avenues for the state of Virginia. My name is Kathy Cole. I own and operate a family-owned business that specializes in maintaining gymnasium equipment for schools. We've been in business now for over 40 years. Our specialized niche is electric partitions, safety devices, and training to prevent accidents and deaths of both students and staff alike. Gym Door Repairs Incorporated, I'm gonna skip that. I'm speaking today, though, as a mother of 5 children and a concerned citizen. Unfortunately, I have answered the phone too many times with a frantic school official on the other end asking for help. There has been yet another accident or death of a student or teacher. There are numerous ways to prevent these accidents. They're not isolated tragedies, they're tragedies happening in isolation. I've personally met with the New York State Department of Education twice regarding deaths and accidents in the United States in this equipment. Once prior to Wesley's death and once after. I was invited by the United States Department of Education to the first public hearing after the Parkland shooting. In New York State, as Wesley's grandma put it, they tried to not operate the partitions while students were in the gym, in the school, and to train the staff and have signs posted by the key switches. So they removed the requirement for the safety device in 1991. Unfortunately, the sign was posted by the key switch, but another child was killed. There was no training implemented. So what New York State did was, prior to 9/11, after the second death, they mandated operator training and the installation of the safety devices, and they got the funding for this law through the school safety funding for metal detectors and security devices, which after 9/11 and post all of the tragic shootings has grown quite a bit. So I would urge Virginia to look into tapping into this funding to prevent the deaths in the school gym. I'm gonna stop reading mine and just quickly, Congressman King, I met with him, he's my congressman. He was aware, of course, of the 2 deaths in New York State that required the law, and after Wesley's death, I asked him if we could meet, and we sat for 45 minutes, and I explained to him that this is a national issue. And by Virginia acting, you have other states looking at what you're going to do to prevent these deaths. I have binders for each of you with 11 states with deaths and accidents in the nation. I've been called to several of them. So Congressman King says as far back as 1993, there have been several accidents and deaths caused by massive motorized partitions in school gyms. These tragic situations can and must be prevented by implementing the appropriate safety devices. Children's lives are precious, and we as a society must do everything in our power to protect them. After the second death of a child crushed and killed in this equipment, exactly like Wesley Lipicki, New York State implemented a law to protect children from being harmed or killed in a similar horrific accident. I commend the Virginia State Legislature for enacting this law that will prevent future tragedies of this nature. With the proper education and safety devices in place, children across Virginia will experience the same level of safety in their school gyms as students throughout New York State have been entitled to by law. History has taught us that these accidents happen more frequently than most people realize. No parent should have to lose his or her beautiful son or daughter due to this safety error ever again. Let Wesley's death bring about reform for the children of Virginia. Wesley's death will save lives. Let Wesley's death be the catalyst to protect the children of Virginia. Then I have, I'm not gonna read them for time constraints, but I do have a statement from a victim that was crushed in an electrically operated partition, and I do have a letter in support of this law from Wesley's best friend, Nate, who witnessed Wesley's death. So they're quite powerful, and I just want to thank you for this time.
Thank you. Take one more.
Lady, gentlemen, thank you very much. I'm Judith Landold Corns. I was employed by the Fairfax County School System for 31 years. 10 of those, I was a physical education teacher and coach, and very familiar with the motorized doors. 14 additional years, I was a school-based administrator who supervised the health and physical education department, and for many of those years, I was also in charge of the plant. I was surprised to hear that Fairfax County Public Schools, which I truly adore and I admire and am very loyal to them, that their position was that staff had been trained on the use of these doors. Over the years that I was involved with the physical plant or supervising or as a teacher myself, my training and everybody that I have spoken with consisted of being handed a key and told that's where you open the door and that's where you close the door. Yes, training can be and must be an essential component to the answer to this tragedy. But training also brings in a human aspect where there's decision making, there's wisdom, there's on the spot deciding what to do, and of course keeping the children's safety in mind. But it has to be a physical mechanism that must be employed in order for there to be a guaranteed assurance that such another tragedy will never happen. I encourage you and I ask you to support this bill and ensure the safety of all of the children and staff in our schools. Thank you.
Thank you.
Anyone? I might travel from out of town, I'm not sure. Okay.
Is anyone who wishes to speak in opposition?
Mr. Chairman, Stacey Haney, School Board Association, I'm not in opposition to this bill. in any way, shape, or form. I do want to just call the subcommittee's attention to just a small phrase in the bill, and I apologize to the patron. Had I seen the substitute in advance, I would have come to see you in advance. But what the bill requires, I want to call your attention to, is on line 23. And so, essentially, if we have a school that has one of these partitions that's not fitted with a sensor, then we either have to install a sensor, which seems to be the best option, but for some of our school divisions right now, that may not be a viable option because of the cost. And so if we can't install a sensor, then we can't operate, we can't open or close the partition anytime any students are present anywhere in the building. And so what that means is you're not gonna be able to do it during the school day. You're gonna have to do it in the middle of the night when there's no students present. The reason that our schools have these partitions is to allow for flexibility. And so we won't have any flexibility in the use of our spaces for those school divisions that aren't able to immediately adopt install the sensor. So it's just that in the building is the key there. I think if we have no issue with the policies or the training or any of the other aspects of the legislation, if we could just have some flexibility so that there are no students present, whether it's in the room or the area or the gymnasium or whatever it is, I think that would give us the ability to put into place safety measures, but still be able to use the facilities in a flexible manner, which is the reason why we have these partitions. So I thank you for your consideration. Again, not opposition to the underlying purpose behind the bill. Thank you.
Thank you. Anyone else?
Chairman Tom Smith, Superintendent Association. I'm not in opposition either. Just had one question. We've seen a lot of bills come to the General Assembly about cooperative planning, particularly when you're trying to renovate or refit something. And it's just the question I would have is, have these devices been looked at in terms of the Uniform Building Code or the Fire Code? Are they okay with that? That would be the only thing as we go forward. And because I'm going to get that question from schools, particularly now that we have bills that say that we're to meet with the local emergency services personnel, the local building code folks whenever we do something like this. So that would just be a question I would have.
Anyone else in opposition? Yeah, I think part of the issue is retrofitting these things. Going forward, it's much easier to make the adjustment. Trying to retrofit is going to be a fitness. I'm not saying it can't be done. I'm just saying it's enough cost.
Could I answer her as to why it says in the building instead of in a room?
Yes, ma'am. Real quickly.
Because it will work if they're not in the building. It might not if they're just not in a room. One of the instances discovered was indeed a child who ran into a room looking for another teacher, I believe, and was killed. And that partition was operated, supposedly, when there were no children in the room. Now, it would be possible, I think, to secure a room. You could lock it, have someone monitor the entrance. But does anyone know how many entrances there are to a school gym? There are a lot. And it's impractical, at least, to say that you can monitor every one of them. You could lock them, I guess. Most of them have locks. I'm not really sure. But my hope is that in the end, school districts will look and say, it's worth the money. We're going to save the life of our children and install the sensors that would protect operators, children, and everybody. But it could, I don't think it would, but it could provide a financial burden on some districts. I think there are PTAs and other community groups that would step in and do everything they could. I've spent the past 6 months talking to hundreds of individuals. Not one person ever said this should not be done or we can't afford this. So, you know, I look at 1753 is a first step. That would give people time to see what they could do with it and maybe add sensors. But it's just not as easy as it sounds to say, don't have any children in the room. And it's
Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, I think that we've been working on a potential friendly line amendment on this end, and I'll just, to the comments that were just made, I think everybody at this table knows that we do an unfunded mandate that's going to go find itself up on the 13th floor, which would potentially do harm to the bill. So I think we're trying to avoid that, but while still putting in all the protections in that we need for these children. So I think Delegate Davis might have some language that would be a friendly amendment to the bill.
On line 23, Mr. Chairman, if we could please strike such such building unless, and insert after in the same room or within view of such partition unless. So if I'm reading this properly, Mr. Chairman, the way it would read on line 23 is when any student is present in the same room or within view of such partition unless such partition includes a safety sensor that.
No,
Let me ask Delegate Sickles first. In order to be a friendly amendment, you have to be friendly too.
Yeah, well, this is the beginning of the legislative process, so I would accept for an amendment. I see there's another delegate down there that might have some more draftsmanship.
Mr. Chairman, I guess, let me be clear that I would be prepared to vote for the original substitute, and pass it out of here. But to the degree that we want to narrow this down, I think I would suggest some language more similar to this. And so on line 23, you remove when any student is present in the building unless, and then you replace it with something along the lines, unless the rooms adjacent to the partition are free of children and all doors are locked, and, or I guess, or such partition includes a thing. And so I think that gets at the concern that you want to make sure that you've ensured that there's no children in the area, and then to the point made earlier, that area has to be secured once you determine that there are no children in there. And that way you don't have the problem of a child accidentally getting into that room. And I'd like to see it much more active than I guess what was originally proposed as a friendly amendment.
Mr. Chairman, it seems at this point, because I do like where Delegate Bullock going better, because I think once you clear a room, you can lock it down. If it pleases the committee, and maybe the best thing to do for even the delegates' recommendation is, for those of us that want to pass it out, which gives Delegate Sickles a little bit of time to wordsmith that exact language on locking down the rooms before we do any of this. That we don't have to kind of fix it on the fly here.
Delegate Sickles, we could act on the bill as the substitute as presented, and then maybe you can work with.
Bring an amendment to full committee.
An amendment to full committee.
That'd be great, Mr. Chairman.
Up a little bit. If there's no objection to that, we'll proceed that way. And motion.
I'll make the motion to report to the full committee, with a written recommendation that Delegate Sickles works with everybody to get some language that will make everyone pleased.
With the substitute, correct?
Yes. Okay, I have a motion properly moved and seconded to recommend reporting the bill under construction.
Thank you, Chairman.
No further discussion. Please cast your vote. The motion carries 7-0. Thank you. Delegate LaRosse.
We double report.
Good bill.
Yeah.
remedied that and got this bill, as is, so I think we've, eliminated that conflict. I will just skim through the explanation of what it does, if you'd like again, Mr. Chairman. Okay, Division of the School Divisions of Innovation legislation that was passed in 2017. It was to provide an additional tool to incentivize and encourage statewide innovation in K-12 education, specifically supporting student preparation for college, career, and citizenship post-high school, as well as promoting economic and workforce development. These local school divisions, if interested, participate in becoming a school district of innovation. They are able to adopt an alternative evidence-based innovative program that is focused on improving student learning, engaging and motivating a greater number of students, promoting personalized learning opportunities, and increasing student success in whatever career path they would do. Getting a little more into the mechanics of how that would look in this legislation, a critical step is taken to enable students to apply what they've learned in assessments that are truly performance-based. Specifically, this legislation would require the Board of Education to develop criteria to determine if a local school board has the capacity to administer and score performance-based assessments. It would require that any performance-based assessment must be adequate to replace, be an adequate replacement of the relevant standards of learning assessment by requiring that students demonstrate the knowledge and skill levels required by the relevant SOL, as well as critical thinking, creativity, collaboration, communication, and citizenship. This would also specify that the SOL assessments eligible for replacement with performance-based testing would be in Virginia Studies, Civics and Economics, Elementary School Science has been taken out by the amendment, and middle school science has also been taken out by the amendment. By seeking innovative options like school divisions innovation, we allow students to be assessed on the application of knowledge that they have learned, and using these as critical tools to better prepare kids to enter the workforce and be life-ready thinkers. Give us the opportunity to do that. Mr. Chairman, I did do my best to answer any questions.
Any questions for everybody?
Mr. Chairman, and Delegate LaRocca, or maybe Ryan can help answer this. And so I'm still trying to make sure I understand how the revised Delegate Landis bill would match with yours. And so I guess my question is, what is the implication of his being a verified credit for graduation versus this being an SOL test, kind of in the traditional way that we're looking at that? Do they work together, I guess is my question.
Mr. Chairman, I don't see any conflict. These two particular courses are events that are usually laid out by the other schools, whereas Virginia is the high school course.
And then I guess, Mr. Chairman, I guess my follow-up question, because I think one of the concerns about any of the performance-based assessments that we do is that even they're performance-based assessments, and I strongly support that, quite honestly, is that you do want to design them in a way that you can still compare school districts. And so I think one of the problems the SOLs originally tried to address is making sure that the students in Loudoun are still learning the same things and up to the same level as a Fluvanna or a Lee or a Wise County. And so I don't know if yours addresses that, or if there's a way to make sure that we address that, just again, so that we can ensure that there's some comparability, among school districts, that they're all performing to an equal level, realizing that I like the idea of performance assessments.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I don't know that this bill specifically addresses this. It does put the charge to the Board of Education to develop this, and to oversee the development of the testing. I think this is a response to what I've heard over and over again when I raise the question, some version of the question, when I speak to educators, parents, and even children, is what do you like least about school? And SOLs aren't right at the top of the popularity list. So again, we're hoping to innovate a way by by exploring this, using this as sort of a pilot program, I guess the will of the legislature was expressed, although in 2017, although there wasn't a specific school district assigned to be the pilot at that time. So Loudoun County has expressed an interest in dedicating the manpower and the resources to move forward with it. But no, this would not be a direct parallel to an SOL test, and accountability, I'm sure, would have to be observed, but I don't have a real specific answers to how a performance-based test would be compared to an SOL.
And Mr. Chairman, if I could, so in my 10-year-old's ranking, it's pizza day for lunch is the first most awful thing, and then it goes down to SOLs after that.
Okay, true.
What's wrong with giving pizza?
Any further questions from subcommittee members?
I have a question, Mr. Chairman. Is any other, state or jurisdiction doing anything of this nature already? Any other state that's kinda implementing, for example, program or pilot program?
Again, Mr. Chairman, it would, this would be the first. So again, this was, the idea was given some degree of a stamp of approval in 2017, and repeating myself, I know. And Loudoun County has stepped up and offered to be the first. Innovation can be a really good thing as long as it's managed very carefully, and that's really what this proposes, to start to look at how we can best accommodate the education process, perhaps while being accountable, but not necessarily under the SOL regimen.
Further questions from subcommittee members? Anyone in the audience wish to speak to the bill? Yes, sir.
Mr. Chairman, Ron Jordan, representing Loudoun County Public Schools. First, to Delegate Bulba's question. In the review process, it would be up to the State Department of Education and Board of Education to determine the comparability with others. Certainly, at some point in time, and to your earlier question about its interaction with Big Chairman's bill, we met with him on Friday on this, and he saw this as laying right on top of it, and saw no conflict whatsoever. To Delegate Tyler, your bill, excuse me, to your question, performance-based assessments are considered best practices. They're seeing more and more states moving to them. This would be the SDI would be the first where you authorize a school division to do this in Virginia, but certainly by no means is it the first nationwide. We're actually not a leader here. We're kind of dragging up the second half of the rear end here in the move to performance-based assessments, because that's the way the world is going. Because when kids get to college, they're not going to get a lot of multiple choice questions. As you and some of us may remember, and I used to teach college, when you get there, it kills the instructor, but you're going to write. You're going to write, you're going to write, you're going to write, because if you can't communicate orally and in writing, you can't be effective in this world. And that's what performance-based assessments are about. They're real-world testing, so that you take the information that you gain and measure how you can apply it. Not whether you can recite it, but how you can apply it. And Loudoun is looking to be a test bed for some of these things, and that was the whole concept when you all passed the SDI legislation several years ago, the Delegate Greason sponsored, was to allow certain schools and certain divisions to be a test bed for innovation under the guidance and supervision of the State Board of Education and the State Department of Education. And I also remind you that you reported this bill last year, this virtually the same bill last year. Thank you.
What happened to this bill last year?
It went to appropriations as usual and never to be seen again. I don't think that's happened to anybody here.
If I may add, Mr. Chairman, by leaving out the two science curriculums, the Board of Education agreed that this would require no additional budgeting, so got it out of the icebox, so to speak.
Mr. Chairman, Tom Smith, Superintendent's Association. Governor LaRock was correct in his description earlier. Not every school division in the Commonwealth right now is ready to take this step. And the school divisions of innovation, when you passed it in terms of a policy issue several years ago, have been establishing them and recognize that. And this would allow other school divisions to learn from Loudoun. Loudoun is ready. There may be one or two others that are ready and can move forward fairly quickly. And so we would support the bill and hope you'll pass it on.
Jeremy Bennett with VACO. Our organization recently adopted a position supporting changes to educational programs and standards that rely less on standardized testing and move toward more critical thinking, such as performance-based assessments. And for that reason, support the Patrons bill.
Thank you.
Hi, good evening. My name is Heidi Bunkua. Thank you, Chairman, and our delegates supporting the Education Subcommittee. I do have a quick question regarding HB 2574 in regards to the loud and representative statement that said if you cannot verbally or if you cannot communicate and write, how does this affect our special needs children who are nonverbal and our children who work on assistive technology? What does this bill do for them? Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, I'm Kathy Berkshire with the Virginia Education Association, and we support the bill.
Thank you. Probably a lot.
I kind of breezed through my prepared comments and don't remember making that specific statement. But would be a select pilot program that I don't see that being relevant to the application.
Throw a lifeline out there.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, like with any other type of program, we'd have to make accommodations.
Emily Webb with the Department of Education. I'm not here to speak in opposition or in favor of the bill. I just wanted to provide some clarification on some of the questions I heard earlier. From House Bill 930 in 2014, when the General Assembly voted to eliminate several SOL tests, the board did develop guidelines for local alternative assessments that local school divisions utilize. Since then, the board has updated it several times to make sure that they continue to provide guidance to local school divisions. It also includes provisions related to reviews, so the department can go in and look at that kind of comparability across school divisions. On the fiscal impact, I don't have an exact fiscal impact, but we do anticipate there would be some small fiscal impact, probably about one position to administer and look at kind of comparability of assessments.
Thank you.
Thank you. A really quick question.
Sure.
So I don't see any, and I recall the State Board of Education had put together kind of a battery of different assessments you could use for these kind of things. I don't see anything specifically that says that you have to use those. But I imagine the State Board of Education approving them would take a look at their own body of work and make sure that they matched up substantially, at least with something that they had developed.
Yes, I would imagine that they would do that. I mean, the local alternative assessments and performance-based assessments are still evolving, and so the department is continuously collecting best practices and looking at what school divisions across the state are doing.
Thank you. Anyone else wish to speak to the bill? Chair will entertain a motion.
Second.
I have a motion to report the bill as amended, properly seconded. Is there further discussion? Hearing none, please cast your vote. That motion carries 8-0. Thank you, Delegate Rock. You have another bill, I believe.
Mr. Chairman, that would be House Bill 2570. Are we ready, Mr. Chairman?
Go right ahead.
Mr. Chairman, I'll start off by stating the goal of this bill, House Bill 2570, is to improve family life education by reversing the current opt-out paradigm to opt-in, thereby encouraging parental involvement in family life education. So currently the law applies to the family life education, otherwise known as sex education in Virginia. It's based on a hypothetical consent whereby parents are presumed to consent to every FLE lesson for their children if they don't take the steps to otherwise opt the children out. So House Bill 2570 would simply require parents give a prior consent opt-in to the sex ed lessons they are comfortable with their children participating in. strongest support for this is just that opt-in would encourage parents to be involved with their children as they learn about sex and relationships. Parents and students are, I think, widely recognized to be better off when parents are more involved. In fact, I have a list of about 7 or 8 studies that I think are very well done and support that. So HB 2570, the bill before you would leave content alone, would in no way affect the content of family life education. Simply ensures that parents would have the information. It presumes that under this opt-in scenario that the school division, school boards, the schools themselves would present the curriculum to the parents. Parents would review it and then basically sign the same form that is presently used, only in this case it would be checking a box that said opt-in instead of opt-out. It also encourages parents to assess appropriateness of the individual child lessons, looking for sensitive topics and determining if they feel that their individual child, who they know, I think, better than just about anybody, would basically make an age-appropriate decision. So again, prompting more opportunities for parents to talk to their kids about those sensitive topics. FLE is continually changing. Other activities, I think, hope you'll find this compelling, but widely recognized that family life education deals with a sensitive subject, and yet other activities that do require opting in are things such as a child getting a work permit. Children don't take driver's ed classes unless they opt in. They don't participate in school sports unless parents opt them in. They don't play an instrument in the school band unless their parents opt them in. They don't receive medical treatment, likewise, unless their parents opt them in. So again, our primary goal is to see that districts do provide FLE curriculum readily to the parents, and that this would also, I think, is worth mentioning that currently parents, especially parents of ESL children, often don't know what their school is presenting to their children. So we're hoping that we would improve on that. And perhaps I'll just read the very brief highlights of these as goals that we are testifying for. Thank you, Chairman.
Any questions for the patrons from the subcommittee members? Anyone in the audience wish to speak to the bill?
Mr. Chairman, members of the subcommittee, my name is Todd Gackey. I'm with the Family Foundation, and we're here to support the bill. When it comes to family life education and the important topics that it discusses, it's essential that we have a process in place that respects the preferences of parents. And we know that with the current process, the default is that the children are going to go through family life education, and then the parents want to come in and then opt them out or request that they not go through the process. And unfortunately, sometimes this is not a very reliable process, and I can speak to that personally because one of my children, we have 4 children, and they, by miracle, brought home the form to us. We signed it and sent it to the teacher, and unfortunately, the teacher did not remove our child. And so we had to answer a lot of questions when our child came home from school. So we think that it is important to have the permission up front to avoid these types of instances. So we would encourage the subcommittee to support this bill.
Thank you.
Zach Robbins with the Department of Education. The administration opposes this bill. There's concern that student participation will substantially decrease if this is changed to an opt-in, resulting in many losing access to this instruction. And also there are requirements in the guidelines that have been developed by the board for substantial community and parental involvement.
Thank you.
Mr. Chair, my name is Tom Torson. I'm with the Virginia Catholic Conference, and we support this bill, HB 2570. And the reason being we support this is that it is fully aligned with Virginia statute. The it's codified Supreme Court decision from 2013, LF versus Bright. The Virginia Code specifically provides that a parent has a fundamental right to make decisions concerning the upbringing, education, and care of the parent's child. And that was a law that was passed in 2013 by this body by very, very decisive margins. In the House of Delegates, it was 70-30, and in the Senate, it was 26-14. And so we believe this bill promotes that engagement by parents, involvement by them, and also transparency overall. We thank you for your consideration, and we respectfully ask for your vote. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hello, my name is Galina Bachena, and I'm the Policy Director of NARAL Coaches Virginia, and we oppose this bill. First, I would say that the current guidelines do comport to the statute and the law as it is in the Virginia Code right now. Then I would also say that over 6,000 teenagers in the Commonwealth became pregnant in 2015 alone. And what multiple studies have shown is that the best way to prevent unwanted pregnancies in teenagers is to provide them with accurate, evidence-based sex ed or family life education. So if the Virginia Department of Education believes that changing the law in this way will significantly decrease the number of participants in this kind of education, and one would imagine that it would also increase the probability of additional teenage pregnancies. And I'm sure that that's not anything that anyone on this committee wants. So I would ask you to vote against this bill.
Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, Stacey Haney, the School Board Association, we have some concerns with the bill as well. In addition to the concerns raised by the other speakers in opposition, I want to point out that family life isn't just sex education. There's a lot of things that the General Assembly has put into the family life education curriculum, not the least of which you passed out earlier, the law of consent, Delegate Thornton's bill. There's also mental health curriculum, I think some curriculum on bullying. So there's a lot of things in family life besides just sex education, and if you make it an opt-in instead of an opt-out, there's going to be a lot of students who don't receive that important instruction. So we would ask that you not support the legislation.
Thank you.
Chairman Thompson, and Superintendent Association, we just simply say we're opposed also.
Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, Michael Malloy, Fairfax County Schools. Parents currently have ample opportunity. We provide them information about our curriculum. They have more than enough opportunity to be able to opt out of anything that they don't wish their students to be involved with. So we would oppose this bill.
Thank you. Anyone else wish to speak to the bill? Any questions for the patron from the subcommittee? Delegate Davis.
Well, comments at the appropriate time, Mr. Chairman.
It's the appropriate time.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, I think in the past I've been relatively moderate on this issue. I think that there's a benefit for children to go and be part of this, and as expressed, sometimes there's other things that are shared during these types of instructions. I think we can all agree there's a couple of scenarios that come into play that is very, very important. One is you want to make sure that the parent knows that this happened for nothing more than just so when little Johnny or little Susie comes home, the parents are ready for the questions that may arise. And giving them a note in the backpack or whatever may not get to the parents to ensure that they have a heads up so when little Johnny and little Susie comes home, they're prepared for the discussion that may come around. But the second piece of the equation that really caught me off guard this last year is what happened in Albemarle. And that's what really trying to turn me on this issue. I can appreciate the comments that was just made about, the parents have information on what's taught in the curriculum. I'm pretty sure the parents were not sent that YouTube video in advance that would make anyone in this room blush. That was shown during the sex ed class in Albemarle upon the approval of the Sexual Assault Resource Agency that approved that YouTube video in a class of students. So my concern is, I think not only does an opt-in scenario ensure that the parent does get that document so they're prepared for the questions that arise, but it definitely ensures that what may have happened in Albemarle does not happen again. I know you hate to, cause problems for everyone because of a few bad actors, but that bad actor was very egregious, and I think we need to protect against it.
John Vogel.
If I could just make a comment, and I guess it'd be that the current system works great and it's not broken. And, you know, I'm a strong believer in parental notification. I wanna know what's going on. I supported Delegate Ranson's bill, because, you know, if you're gonna be dealing with explicit material or material dealing with violence, I wanna be able to have the opportunity to review that. But with that said, I as a parent, get that information, I review it seriously. I've had conversations with all three of my kids about what might be in family life education. And I would hate to think, because I think the point was very well made, is that family life education includes a lot of really important things that students are gonna need to have for their entire life. And I'd hate to think that we're throwing the baby out with the bathwater just because of one example of where we might have needed more parental notification, and quite frankly, we fixed that. And I think that's the appropriate course, is to fix stuff like that, not to go ahead and upend the entire system, which I think is working well.
Okay, Delegate Collins.
If I gotta ask a question of, I'll throw this out, probably the superintendents who always say, which always makes me feel uncomfortable. Every year, you send home a requirement for first responders, you know, who's your parent, address, your school route. That's usually a required form to bring back to the school. If that was, is that a school by school district form, or is that something that we require?
That's done on a school district. I mean, I think generally every school division sends something home, but what exactly goes home varies to the school division.
I'm just wondering if that is the box to check should be on that form if we were doing this, if we were looking at doing something like this, but because I just did because my son just started 6th grade, so excuse me, Mr. Chairman, if I could ask a follow-up, I try to apologize, Mr. Chairman. You know, withdraw it. Thank you. Thank you very much for answering my question.
Any other questions for the paper or for testified? Hearing none. Yes,
If I don't, just goes briefly, I won't read the summaries of these 4 very credible studies, but they all point to the same very obvious conclusion, that studies support that teachers instinctively know, parents instinctively know, that students do better academically and socially when schools build a positive relationship with families. We've heard concerns, we've heard an imagination about pregnant teenagers, and you know, none of us want to see teenagers becoming pregnant. But the real question is not, are we going to upend the status quo? It's really, do you want parents to be involved? And I would say just form a picture. This is a picture in my mind, that if my child came home from school, perhaps upset, maybe I hadn't been on the ball talking about something like sexual relations between a man and a woman, what I want to know about, would I be in a better position if I had opted in and seen the course material and knew approximately when that child was going to learn about that, or to wait until my child comes home and is perhaps a little bit upset about what they learned? Apply that to relationships. It's not just sex ed, as the point was raised, about how to interact with other students. I think kids are always going to be better equipped when parents know ahead of time what the content is, and perhaps even have an idea when they should start the discussion, so that maybe even the discussion would start at home. And the parents would say, you know, this is what I think, this is what you're going to learn today in school, and I hope you'll weigh the two together. So, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, I hope that we will vote today to make parents more involved in this very sensitive material. You will vote.
Okay. Chair will entertain a motion. Move the report.
Second.
Moved and seconded to recommend supporting House Bill 2570. No further discussion. Hearing none, please cast your vote. That motion fails on a 4-4 vote.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee.
The others are out. Delegate Hope.
Chairman, members of the subcommittee.
House Bill 1643.
We do have an amendment in nature of substitute. I don't know what your
Worked it out with subsection.
Yes, sir, I did, yeah, no, this has been some massaging going on.
Let's get the substitute properly before us. Move the substitute. Without objection, substitute is accepted.
Mr. Chairman, members of the subcommittee, this bill does basically a couple things. One, it creates an alternative pathway for licensure, and it also helps address our teacher shortage. This bill was brought to me by my jurisdiction in Arlington that wanted to approve a licensure for teachers that have completed an accredited Montessori program. It would allow the Board of Education to vet these alternate routes for quality and alignment with the expectations for the Commonwealth teachers. It doesn't specifically say about the Montessori licensure, but it would allow for that pathway if the Board of Education decided to go in that direction. And that is what the bill does, Mr. Chairman.
Questions for the patron from the subcommittee? Hearing none. Anyone in the audience wish to speak on the bill?
Good afternoon. I'm Lila Wise, representing the Arlington schools. Arlington has a robust Montessori program, and this is the only public school in Virginia that does have such a program. We actually are going to have about 40 classrooms and are going to move into a new Montessori school this year. As part of our Montessori program, we're looking for teachers, and we've found it very difficult to find teachers who have both Montessori accreditation and have Virginia licensure. So in discussing the problem with Delegate Holt and with the State Department, we talked about some other ways of looking at this. And rather than coming to the General Assembly every year and asking for new licenses, what we've come up with is this process that you see here. And this is a process whereby anyone looking for any kind of new licensure would go through, would ask for waivers and go through this process with the state board. You've already seen this process in Delegate Robinson's bill, and she had a bill looking for licensure, and so she now has this kind of an amendment also coming up with this new process. And this can be something that will be used by a lot of people. With a teacher shortage, we're looking for very creative ways to get teachers into our classrooms. And this is a creative way where people can go through a process, state board will vet them. It will be a quick process too, and so I'm hoping that you will support this. Thank you.
Thank you. Anyone else wish to speak to this? Subcommittee, what's before us, I'll entertain a motion. Motion before us.
Second.
Properly moved and seconded to report the bill. Is there further discussion? As a substitute. If there's no further discussion, please cast your vote. That motion carries 8-0.
Thank you,
Delegate
Chairman.
Hope. Delegate Tran.
I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. Hold on. Mr. Chairman, I wasn't sure if you could see me behind Delegate Hustle's chair.
You're just a little bit over there. That's all you.
Ready? Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee. I'm here to chat about House Bill 2463. This bill would shift the burden of proof in due process hearings under the Federal Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. This bill came to me from a constituent who's in the audience today. She is a parent of a student with a disability and also a dedicated attorney who represents many families in due process hearings. You may be aware, currently Virginia law is such that the burden of proof in due process hearings lies with the party bringing forward the case. So this is just a fundamental problem in our education system that has created a situation where parents are really in an uneven playing field when they brought a due process hearing forward against the schools. Schools have the expertise, they have the resources, and they have access to all of the information about the child's education. I have had a chance in the last couple of weeks to meet with many, many stakeholders and have heard from both sides on this issue. And I want to just address some of the concerns that I think those opposing this bill will bring up. Number one, that there will be a dramatic increase of due process hearings that would create financial burdens on the schools. Currently, the process in place, I've heard they believe works because Virginia has parental consent laws and an intended collaborative IEP process. Further, there are also lots of community resources that would be available to parents to access free to low-cost programs or services such as advocates and legal services. So we've done some looking into this issue around increasing lawsuits or due process hearings. So there are other states that have shifted the burden, and when you look at the data from the other states, there has not been an increase in the number of due process hearings after those states have shifted the burden. And so we've looked at data from Delaware, Connecticut, New Jersey, Arkansas, DC, and New York. Further, there's the issue around access to available, advocates or legal services that could help parents through this process. Even though Virginia has a process that's intended to be collaborative and with our existing parental consent laws, unfortunately, before you get to due process, parents don't always have access to that information. In many cases, parents have to actually pay to have documents translated if they're English language speakers. They actually have to pay for access to some of these documents for those copies. And then there are already engaging in a process where they're paying for, and sometimes advocates or legal representation leading up to the due process hearing itself. And so those resources that a school might provide to a parent for the due process hearing, sometimes those lawyers are not special education experts. They also have large cases themselves and may not be able to devote an appropriate amount of time to focusing on this parent and their child. So there are lots of complications around that factor as well. Those in opposition have also brought up to me that it's kind of legal precedence for the party that brings forward a proceeding to bear the burden of proof. So I just want to cite that in the Supreme Court case of Schaefer versus Wiest, the Supreme Court did not preclude states from shifting the burden of proof through state law. And in fact, there have been several states, as I mentioned earlier, that have actually shifted that burden of proof already. And here in Virginia, we've actually moved in that direction where we've shifted the burden in certain disciplinary cases related to special education due process proceedings. So there has been some movement in Virginia already. Then lastly, and it's a little bit of different things. I've also, I want to say, heard overwhelmingly from parents across the Commonwealth about the experience that they've had in the IEP process, as well as this particular process too, this particular process. And many of them are here to share their personal stories with you today, traveling from very far distances in the Commonwealth. And I want to say, I think when we look at the whole entire process, and I'm not steeped into it deeply, but when you look at the whole entire process, I want to frame that by saying I support our teachers, and I believe that for the vast majority of times, our schools and our teachers are doing their utmost best to support all of our children. But there comes to be a point where the process as it's intended to be just simply breaks down, and that's why you're in the due process hearing portion of this piece under IDEA. And so it's an emotional process, it's a financially expensive process, but I think we have to really look at how do we even the playing field to ensure that all of our children, including those with, in special education, are receiving a free and appropriate public education as has been, determined under IDEA that we need to be moving forward with. So I welcome the questions and the conversation today. I think it's really important to have this public discourse.
Thank you, Delegate. Are there any questions from subcommittee members for the delegate? Anyone in the audience wish to speak to the delegate? Let me just ask before we get started, since there's so many, please be brief.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, I respectfully request some leniency as parents of children with disabilities have traveled from as far as Roanoke and Lynchburg to come speak on this bill. So I'm hopeful that we can go through this quickly. Thank you. I'd like to speak in support of HB 2463 and shed some light on the reality of special education process in Virginia. My name is Sherry Belkowitz, and I am a parent and a special education attorney. I also serve on the board of directors of the ARC of Northern Virginia, and I'm also the chair of the Advisory Committee for Students with Disabilities for Fairfax County Public Schools, which is our SEAC. Although I speak to you today on behalf of myself as a parent and a special ed attorney. I have 3 children who have attended or are attending public schools in Virginia, 2 of whom have had IEPs. In fact, I became a special education attorney because my husband, also a lawyer, and I had to fight for about 6 years to get an IEP for our daughter who has autism. In fact, the school district refused to acknowledge diagnoses from multiple practitioners and even falsified documents after we learned that the school psychologist had misrepresented his credentials. I have the benefit of practicing all over this fine state. I have had clients as far west as Russell County, as far north as Frederick County, and as far south as Chesapeake. I have had clients in Stanton, Fredericksburg, Poquoson, Virginia Beach, Fairfax, Richmond, as well as the counties of Fauquier, Albemarle, Spotsylvania, Stafford, Frederick, Dinwiddie, and Fairfax, among many, many others. The due process system in Virginia is too onerous, too costly, and too difficult for parents to use to pursue violations. School districts use that knowledge to avoid complying with the laws. In IEP meetings, parents are outnumbered, and they do not have the time, the knowledge, or energy to learn the complex maze of special education laws and regulations. Shifting the burden of proof is necessary to remedy the imbalance of power that permeates the entire process. I have had school employees in various districts, including the ones I just named, tell me that the parents in their district cannot afford an attorney or advocate, so the school need not follow the laws. I have seen school districts ignore the requirements of the law, knowing that parents are unlikely to bring a due process case. Many school districts are represented by large private law firms who use legal tactics to wear down parents by criticizing the parents, ridiculing their advocacy, and depleting their bank accounts. There is little sense of cooperation in this dispute resolution process where lawyers seek to win, forgetting there is a child involved. School systems claim that parents have access to all the data. That is patently untrue. On a recent visit to VDOE, I spoke to a complaint specialist about a school district that continually refuses to provide parents data on the child's IEP goals, something that the parents are legally entitled to. The VDOE employee said to me, well, does the IEP say written data? Because if it doesn't say written data, the parents aren't entitled to it. What other kind of data is there? In another recent case in a different county, I requested the child's cumulative file under FERPA, IDEA, and Virginia law. I cited 8 VAC 2081-170, which states the local education agency shall comply with this request without unnecessary delay and before any meeting regarding an IEP. I requested the file on October 24th, November 21st, and November 29th. 3 IEPs meetings occurred during that time period without the parents receiving a single record. This is not access to data and information, and it prohibited meaningful participation in the process by the parents. In a recent due process hearing in Roanoke, the attorneys for the school district refused to provide requested documents even after the hearing officer issued a subpoena. School districts go to great lengths to avoid providing information. Indeed, in one district, the school employee in charge of FOIA requests demonstrated the district's disdain for sharing information in 2 Facebook posts, writing, "Let's be honest, folks who FOIA or FERPA entities for information are basically doing it to be PETAs, pain in the blanks, trust and believe." So to that I say, KMA, kiss my blank. And it goes on. This is the person in charge of providing
And I'm going to have
requests.
to ask you to wrap up.
Yes, I will. School districts say that shifting the burden of proof undermines our legal system and would increase the number of lawsuits. In Virginia, expedited due process hearings, which are the disciplinary hearings, the burden has already shifted to the school district and the numbers have decreased. So the burden on the school district, the numbers have decreased. I urge you to support this bill, which comports with the purpose of IDEA to make states support the rights of children with disabilities and their families. The law is intended to ensure that students with disabilities become independent members of society to the greatest extent practicable. And by supporting this bill, the burden of proof will be placed back in the school system where professionals can guide the parents and the students in the right direction. We cannot afford to leave our students behind in Virginia.
Those of you in support who are lined up to speak, you're going to have to be much briefer than that, or we're going to have to limit the number of people.
Thank you for the opportunity to represent both myself and my husband as we support this bill. We are from Roanoke. We are the parents of a child with a disability, and we've participated in 2 due process hearings in Virginia over the past 2 years. Both hearings were assigned to the same hearing officer, both were filed against the same school board, and both were overwhelmingly uncollaborative, unproductive, and anti-parent. The problem is this: not only are parents required to bear the burden of proof without equal access to financing for legal representation, expert witnesses, and information held tightly by the school boards, but we also bear this burden in a system that is openly biased in favor of school boards. This creates a double obstacle for parents engaging in due process. Parents have to both bear the burden of proof and clear high obstacles created by hearing officers in their professed deference to school boards. I do not use the term bias lightly. The hearing officer for our hearings openly stated, both orally and in writing, that he was required to show deference to the school boards. He did so in many ways. I have several examples that I could share, but I'm going to skip on. I've heard that an argument to this bill is that if parents cannot afford legal representation, school boards can provide them with lists of advocates. We personally chose to hire an attorney for several reasons. One being that there is no attorney-client privilege in a due process between a parent and an advocate. Our family is in the very unique situation of being able to afford the upfront cost of hiring legal representation, but it has been a huge financial burden on our family. We've spent thousands of dollars on expert witnesses and evaluations, only to have them thrown out by the hearing officer. We are also in our 2nd year now of paying for our son's private placement, since the administrative due process hearings have utterly failed us in Virginia. We did try to resolve our differences with the school board prior to due process. We filed a complaint with the Office of Civil Rights, and the school board did enter a resolution agreement because of it. However, we have continued to fight the due process battle, and this has cost everyone money. This has cost the school district hundreds of thousands of dollars in special education funds. I believe that if we shift the burden of proof to the school board, it would actually cut down on frivolous lawsuits, because school boards would be more accountable up front for fixing their mistakes, like those found in our situation by the Office of Civil Rights.
And I'm going to ask you to wrap up, please.
Yes, sir. In complete honesty, had I known how ineffective the due process system in Virginia would be, I never would have gone this route. Instead, we've had to file in federal court, and we've wasted 2 years. Thank you.
gonna have to do better than that.
Mr. Chairman, members of the subcommittee, my name is Saad Al-Amin. I'm with Strategic Litigation Consultants. Over the last 2 years, I have litigated over 25 due process cases in Richmond, Henrico, Virginia Beach. And I just would like to share with you just one small comment. When the serial bank robber, Willie Sutton, was asked, "Why do you rob banks?" And he said, "That's where the money is." And that's the same sentiment. The school board, and 100% of what happens in a child with a disability, and the eligibility and all of the other things that go along with that happens within the school. So the schools have 100% of all of the information with regard to these cases, and they should be required to produce that evidence. They should be required to have the burden of proof to indicate that they have given this child a free, appropriate public education. Because in exchange for that, they get millions of dollars from IDEA to do this work. And so asking them to provide the information is an essential quid pro quo with regard to the money that they get and the responsibility they have. Thank you.
Thank you. That's much better.
Good afternoon. I'll be very brief. My name's Kim Lindberg. I am a parent of a child with a disability, and I have a small advocacy business in the Lynchburg area. I volunteer heavily with the FACES organization that serves southwestern Virginia and parts unknown. Most of the work FACES does is pro bono work. During the fall, we saw 20+ families in Allegheny County, and not one of those parents is anywhere near filing a process case. If this were to pass, it would be a culture change for special education in Virginia. It would go all the way down to the bottom where we're focused on living up to the promise of IDEA and not taking the easy way out, because schools know that parents can't pay for it. We don't have the emotional resources. We are too busy taking care of our children. I was thinking today about parents I know that have been through due process. For every one parent that has been through due process, I easily know 4 or 5 more that have decided to homeschool or moved. Can you imagine that? So instead of getting what you need at your local school, you pack it all up and move rather than trying to fight. And that really is the reality our families deal with every day. So everything everyone else has said, definitely we need this change in Virginia. Thank you.
I'm gonna take one more speaker. We still have 5 bills to hear, folks. I think we spent adequate time on this.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and delegates. My name is Harold Valkwitz. I am a special education attorney. I'm also the parent of children, 2 of whom have special education and have IEPs. I'd just like to read you a couple short quotes for you. Earlier, a comment was made about a Facebook post by the FERPA and Freedom of Information Act person in a county school district. Another posting by that person said, "I hate the Freedom of Information Act. You don't need to know. People just need to live in ignorant bliss." And that's the way schools approach the collaborative nature of the due process proceedings in special education. The other quotes I'd like to read for you, forcing parents to bear the burden of proof is to treat the school district's judgment as superior to that of parents. Parents are already at a disadvantage vis-a-vis the school when disputes arise under the IDEA, because parents generally lack specialized training because their views are often treated as inherently suspect due to the attachment to the child. Given that the IEP can transform a child's life, if the school district wishes to implement an IEP over the parent's objections, then it is entirely reasonable to ask the school district to provide the evidence necessary to support its decision. Placing the burden of proof on schools promotes government accountability, and it promotes fundamental fairness. All of those quotes were said by the Attorney General of Virginia in a brief filed on behalf of the Commonwealth of Virginia with the United States Supreme Court in asking in an amicus brief to shift the burden of proof to the school districts and alternatively to allow the states to have school districts bear the burden. As Delegate Tran said, the Supreme Court in that case decided to not make a decision on whether on that matter because the case that was before the court in that circumstance did not involve a state statute. We are asking that you support HB 2463 and consistent with what the Commonwealth of Virginia has previously stated to the United States Supreme Court, shift the burden of proof in all due process cases to school districts. Thank you.
Thank you. Let me do this. If you're in support of this bill, please raise your hand. Okay, thank you. Anyone in opposition to the bill? What's that?
Good evening, Mr. Chairman and subcommittee members. Thank you for this opportunity. My name is Angela Neely. I am a Special Education Director for Culpeper County Public Schools. I'm also the President of the Virginia Council of Administrators of Special Education, a professional organization that represents over 300 special educators across the Commonwealth. We urge you to vote against HB 2463 for many reasons. Virginia does exceed the federal IDEA special education regulations with 192 additional requirements. One of those requirements is parent consent for every initial placement, evaluation, and change in services. This is unique to Virginia. There are only a few states that have this level of parental control over services. Virginia parents do, as you've already heard, have access to low-cost or free advocacy or legal services. As a special educator, I respect parent advocacy for their children, as do my colleagues. Virginia has many valuable resources to assist parents in advocacy. The Parent Education and Advocacy Training Center, the Center for Family Involvement at VCU, the Virginia Board of People with Disabilities are just a few of the many resources, training, and advocacy resources available for parents. You've already heard about how difficult due process hearings are, how costly they are. No one wins in a due process hearing. The speakers that came before me are absolutely right, that a lot of times it's not the child that wins in these situations. We believe there would be an increase in requests for due process hearings with this bill. We have already seen a large increase in requests for due process hearings at a tremendous financial and human resources cost for school divisions. Instruction suffers when school districts are involved.
And I'm gonna ask you to wrap up.
Okay.
You've been here a long time.
I understand. I think one of the significant increases that you will see with this bill is an increase in CSA costs, and there's already a lot of work to reduce those costs. I believe with this bill there will be tremendous pressure on school divisions to utilize CSA resources to place children in private placements. So I urge you to vote against this bill.
Thank you. Anyone else in opposition? Please be brief.
Stacey Haney on behalf of the Virginia School Board Association. I want to bring 2 points to your attention, then I'll let my colleagues raise some of the other concerns. We're absolutely opposed to this legislation for a number of reasons. First of all, Mr. Chairman, if you put the burden of proof on the school division, what you're doing is saying that the education, the IEP that the school division is proposing is presumptively wrong. It's presumptively wrong if you put the burden on the school division. And so if you think that we have a teacher shortage today, if you think that we have a shortage of qualified special education teachers today, then what do you think is going to happen when the General Assembly sends the message to those special education teachers that they are presumptively wrong in the education that they propose to provide to students? The second point I want to bring to the subcommittee's attention is that if you are concerned, and I know many of you are, about the already increasing cost of private placements under the CSA, then you should be really concerned about this legislation. This legislation absolutely will lead to increased private placements, which will then have to be funded pursuant to the CSA. And so this bill will have a huge fiscal impact, not only to localities because of the increased legal fees, but also to the state because of increased private placements. And so we would urge you to vote against this legislation.
Thank you. Tom, brevity is a virtue.
I'll try. Chairman Tom Smith, Superintendent's Association. I've been involved in the special ed process since I got into education in 1977. Back then, as the chairman may remember, it was called 94-142. We have seen it evolve over time, and each time there's been a major involvement, and I've gone through a number of reauthorizations and changes in regulations. There's trying to be a balanced process, a balancing and looking at what the schools are required to do, improve, and along with parent rights and responsibilities. We see that in that Virginia has, and you've heard it mentioned, a number of parent right situations in excess of the IDEA. This has been a balance. It's one that I think has worked for that there have been difficult times, but one that I think has worked. Now, if this bill were to pass, then I think that balance would be upended. And what we would see are some of the difficulties that have already been described. So we hope you would reject the bill.
Very briefly, please.
Good evening, I'm Nia Hamlet. I'm the Assistant Superintendent for Instructional Support within Rico County Public Schools. And I just urge you to we oppose this bill, and I just want to share briefly, we do genuinely appreciate the advocacy of parents and what they need to do for their children in order for their students and their children to receive a free and appropriate public education. I will say in Henrico, we're working really hard to employ strategies to engage our families in the IEP process, and this bill will make it increasingly difficult for us to realize that goal, especially when complaints are filed by those who tend to misguide or misrepresent or even manipulate parents for their own benefit. So if this bill is passed, it will cause major issues. The one point that I do want to make is that in reference to the CSA impact, we would be forced, school divisions would be forced to not just consider those dispute resolution processes in the manner in which we currently do, but also to operate like claims adjusters. What's going to be best for the student and most appropriate for the student, but also we're going to be forced with results that really look at private placements, which will significantly increase those CSA costs, because we're going to have to bend in order to do what's going to get that case resolved instead of working closely with families to resolve it at the school level. And then the only other thing I'll just add is that with the shortage of special education teachers who have to go through that contentious due process hearing process also would be faced with looking at resignation and other things because they are already taxed and struggling with the current jobs that they have. Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, Jim Council, Prince William, I'll be very brief. I wanted to touch on a legal issue. The patron referred to the Schaefer case, and she's exactly right when she said that court did not prohibit a state from setting a different rule. But in fact, they expressly dodged the question and didn't rule anyway on it. But many of you may be familiar with Bill Hurd, former Deputy AG, Virginia Solicitor General, private attorney, private practice, very active in this field. During that hearing, and this is just 4 lines of dialogue, Justice O'Connor, who by the way wrote the majority opinion, do you think it's open to a state to adopt a general rule on who has the burden of proof under the statute? Mr. Hurd, Your Honor, we think it is not. We believe it is a federal question. Justice O'Connor, have some states purported to adopt a general rule on that? Mr. Hurd, some have, Your Honor. The Justice again, and you think that's invalid? Mr. Hurd, well, we believe yes, Your Honor. We believe it is a federal question. So there's a serious question as to whether we even have the authority here to do what this bill purports to do.
Thank you. Yes, sir.
Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, Tony Valentino with Hanover County Public Schools. For reasons you've already heard stated, we oppose the bill.
Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, Jeremy Bennett with VACO. For the reasons stated, we have concerns over the fiscal implications of increased litigation and private placements, and for that reason we oppose the bill.
Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, Michael Moore, Fairfax County School, I definitely appreciate the delegate's time. She's worked with us and talked with us about this legislation. For the reasons stated, we oppose the legislation.
Dr. Grant, next word.
You know, sir, I just want to say I really appreciate the parents who came to share their personal stories, and for those who weren't able to share them, I know that the ones you did hear, I think, give you a good sense of the very difficult situations that parents are facing through the IEP process. It's not working as intended for everybody, and I think that this bill is trying to kind of right-size the ship, so to speak, and level the playing field in the discussion around due process. I do want to say around private placement and tuition reimbursement, we do say in the bill that if you are a parent bringing forward a request for tuition reimbursement, you have the responsibility to provide the burden of proof in those cases. So this is getting to the heart of the question for a lot of these families is how do I ensure that my child has a free and appropriate education and working towards that. And so I hope that you will help us and allow us to continue this conversation and vote favorably for this bill.
Members of the subcommittee, we do have a letter from the speaker to refer this bill to appropriations if we act favorably. So the chair will entertain a motion. Mr. Chairman.
If I could, and I deeply appreciate the delegate bringing this, and I want to say to all the speakers, thank you very much for coming down here. This was a really important discussion, and there are issues that I don't think all of us face every day, and I know you do, and so a lot of that was eye-opening for me. I think that the concern is, and I think one of the speakers used the word sea change, and so it is. And I think we are ill-equipped here at this table at 6:30 in the afternoon to make some of those decisions. That said, I also don't want to let this go because I think it does deserve a lot more discussion. And so what I want to propose, Mr. Chairman, is that I think that there is a way for us to have our cake and eat it too. Because my understanding is that there is a JLARC study going on right now dealing with the effectiveness of our special education programs. And so rather than having this go to appropriations or having this being tabled, I think what I would propose is that we pass by the legislation and request that the chair of education ask for JLARC to go ahead and take this up as part of their study. My understanding is they've just started this study, and so the timing couldn't be more perfect to be able to go ahead and work through those issues in an orderly manner. And that way, next year, we can have a better understanding of how we go ahead and make sure that this moves forward in an organized way, and that we understand all the different issues.
Second. Okay, we have a motion properly seconded to refer the bill to full committee and then to incorporate it into the JLARC study. Is there further discussion?
Mr. Chairman, one from the picture with this possible. Possible for us to hear from the picture?
Yes.
About Delegate Bulova's idea to have the JLARC, the JLARC study incorporate this question. I think that would be a helpful way to continue this discussion. You can see clearly a lot of passion on both sides, and I think that would allow us to, continue the public discourse. I think that's really important on this issue.
The motion is before you, properly moved and seconded. If there's no further discussion, cast your vote. Voice vote. Okay, all in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Chair is opposed. Okay, thank you, Dr.
Thank you.
Chairman, you do it.
Chairman, thank you. Some bills I know have you kind of know where the outcome is going to be, but I think there's sometimes an opportunity to discuss these things. This is, Mr. Chairman, I know you've seen these before, House Bill 2646.
what it does is it's gonna bring down class sizes. The bill would mandate reduction in class sizes from 29 to 28 in kindergarten, 30 to 28 in grades 1, 2, 3, 35 to 29, maximum 4, 5, and 6. I think this is discussion that we really need to have. I know it's expensive. And one of the things I think I'd like to do is continue, I think similar to what you just said, continue this discussion, figure out how we publicize, how we find the money for these things. I've got a sister-in-law who teaches in Fairfax County Public Schools. And it is listening to her talk about how she deals with this every day, and she loves her job. But trying to deal with 30 kids, 30-some kids is a challenge sometimes. And, you know, you have 30, 35 kids, sometimes they're not getting all they need out of their teachers too. So I know we have to do this. Mr. Chairman, I don't know if anybody here wants to speak briefly on it, but I also spoke to the Chairman Landis. He said it might be useful to pass it by for the day, and then we would have the opportunity to continue the discussion, and then we would strike it or lay it on the table for today. But I don't know if somebody wants to speak on this real quickly, but I just think we all need to be thinking about these teachers' labor daily.
Let me see if we have any questions from subcommittee members first. And we don't.
Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, I'm Kathy Burks with the Virginia Education Association. We appreciate Delegate Hugo shining a light on this. We had a conversation in session about this issue and about what we know will be the fiscal impact when this is put into the SOQs. But again, we agree with the delegate. This is something that we must look at. I know the Board of Education, while they're still sitting on that long list of revisions to the standards of quality, they have even considered also looking at the class size SOQs. So I think it's recognition across the Commonwealth. And of course, you're hearing a lot of testimony today about challenges facing our schools and the need to meet all of our students where they are, and we can't do that with the types of class sizes currently funded in the standards of quality. So we certainly understand the fiscal impact, but we are grateful to the delegate for shining a light on this issue.
Doug, if you go and,
Mr. Chairman.
Speaker's letter, we do have a speaker's letter to refer this to appropriations if we activate it. Yes, sir.
Mr. Chairman, I'm John Sezel with Virginia Professional Educators. For the reasons stated, we also support the bill. Thank you.
Thank you. Any further discussion on the bill? Not, I will entertain a motion.
Move forward.
Second. I have a motion to recommend reporting and referring the bill to appropriations. All those in favor, well, please cast your vote. The motion carries 8-0.
Chairman, that's better than I thought. Thank you, and thank y'all for thank y'all for entertaining the discussion of the thoughts. I'm leaving right now. Quick moment ahead. Thank you, sir.
Delegate Van Auken first. May get the award for most educated.
Okay. Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, this is the same thing we voted on last week, but to try to ease the pain of the appropriations, did not like that it was in the SOQ code. We have a substitute that's going around, and they said that if we pass the substitute out, it's the same content, it's the exact same content, they will be willing to relook at the letter they put on it. That doesn't mean that it'll change, we're trying.
There's a Romanettes, by the way, I found that out.
Yes, Romanettes, yes, correct, correct. So I don't, if you want me to go back over the bill, I can.
But there's nothing's changed in the bill.
No content has changed.
We still have a speaker's letter.
Right, and so it would need to be reported and referred, and then they said once there was a substitute that was in the committee, they would look back at it again. Promising nothing, but.
I guess,
But asking for a lot.
We're trying, because I think it's a good bill, and I'd like to see it get through. I mean, I think having teachers, I think local localities can plan ahead for planning, and there's still that emergency clause there. There's still flexibility. We're talking about the thing that will help make teachers' lives easier. We're talking about teachers. I don't need to go back on to that, I guess, but.
Doug, I don't know a lot of teachers, but I don't know any that would love to have short of adding 15 minutes to the school day, which I could not support, I don't know how we do it. Anyone else? Subcommittee?
We need to move the substitute.
We do need to move the substitute. Move the substitute. Without objection, substitutes accepted. Anyone in the audience wish to speak to the bill?
Mr. Chairman, I'm John Silver, with Virginia Professional Educators. We received more concerns about planning time than any other issue, so we strongly support the bill. We commend the sponsor for sponsoring the bill, and so we strongly support it. Thank you.
John, do you have a plan for implementing?
No, sir. Give me another 15, 20 minutes, and I'll get back to you.
Oh.
Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, again, exactly the issues we're having with our Virginia Education Association, planning time being their number one issue. Absolutely appreciate the chair's consideration about how do you do this without extending a school day. But I think, again, not that we want to continue to admire problems here in Virginia, but I think this is an important problem to look at and to consider and recognize, again, when you're differentiating instruction for individual needs, that takes additional planning time. And when your class sizes are larger, it takes even more. And so I don't have a plan either. I certainly appreciate the chair's recognition of the problem, but again, I think it's an important piece to shine a spotlight on, and we are appreciative to Delegate Van Valkenburg for doing that.
Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, Stacey Haney with the Virginia School Board Association. We have concerns with the bill. We would certainly love to be in a position to be able to provide this amount of planning time to our teachers, but until the General Assembly removes the support staff cap, our hands are tied, because if the teachers are in their planning time and aren't supervising the students, then someone has to, and those staff were eliminated with the imposition of the support staff cap. And so until we can do something about that, it's an unfunded mandate on the localities, something like this, and so we have to oppose that. But we would love to work with the delegates at the General Assembly to figure out a way to fund those support positions and fund additional positions in our schools so that we can provide additional planning time for our teachers.
Chairman Tom Smith, Superintendent Associate. Mr. Chairman, you're exactly right. There's no more probably regulated piece of what we do than the elementary day in terms of reading, writing, and different subjects, what you have to do with that. So this is just going to create an issue with that. And as I said the last time, when you're going from 30 to 45 minutes, that is a cost.
Anyone else wish to speak to the bill? Delegate Van Valkenburg.
To your point, the rationale behind this bill is right now, they don't have to think about teachers having unencumbered planning periods, so they don't. And so they don't think ahead on how they can properly plan a schedule to ensure that every teacher has that. And there is the escape clause of an emergency. If you need to take that time, you need to take that time. So I would just submit that this bill forces them to plan ahead, to be thinking about how they can get those teachers that time when they currently don't, because they don't have to.
Any further discussion from the subcommittee? Chairman Davis.
Just clarity. Maybe I should answer the question prior. I think there's a couple of times during the course of the day where there may be an opportunity for teachers to get a break. I'm more familiar with middle school and high school, but on the elementary school level, I would imagine those times would be when the teacher drops the students off at the library, or art, or music. And every day, I think, is a transition where the students are dropped off somewhere. The other point would be the cafeteria, when students go for lunch. And so those are opportunities where I thought this bill was trying to say, these are the times when the teacher should be able to go to the teacher's lounge or go make copies or whatever that is that they need to do without students present. Am I unclear on this?
Any further discussion on the bill?
Chairman, a couple of comments. Excuse me.
Nobody else?
I just don't see how this bill is not an an unfunded mandate. Maybe you can explain it to me that it's not, but it looks like it is. And then to extend the school day, I would think that's a significant cost as well. But I don't, you know, I don't like the cost, I don't like the unfunded mandate to our localities.
Anyone else? Chair will entertain a motion.
Move the report.
Second.
Substitute motion to lay on the table.
I have a substitute motion to lay the bill on the table that takes precedence. Did I get a second for that? No.
I'll second it.
Okay, that's a recorded vote.
No, second, I did, yeah, I was responding to Doug and Bagby, I apologize, Mr. Chairman.
He has a disruptive nature.
He does, I'm sorry.
Okay, motion is to lay the bill on the table, please cast your vote. That motion carries 5-3. Mr. Delegate. Delegate Goditis.
Mr. Chairman.
I appreciate the kind of, John has a bill that we're talking about a little bit, he and I have already spoken, so, thank you. Very nice.
Okay.
This is about HB 2720, about the use of school safety grants and wanting to use them for brick and mortar projects. It gives schools more flexibility to meet their individual security needs. This has to do with the Public School Security Equipment Grant Act from 2013, which provided grants of up to $100,000 for schools to purchase security equipment as long as they do a 25% match. The Virginia Department of Education approves the proposals and provides a list of equipment that the schools can purchase. So this bill came to me from my local Clark County Public Schools, and they've used the grants for some security equipment, but they don't have some of the physical infrastructure, specifically the safe vestibules in all their little old school, especially the elementary schools. Clerk, this is just a letter from our local superintendent, in case you want to take a look at it. And so the request was to make those grants available for physical infrastructure. So the Department of Education confirmed that the bonds can be used to cover capital projects, and they can be used to cover architecture and engineering costs for approved projects. So as far as we know, there's no reason that the original intent of the grants was not to use it for this.
Questions for the table?
All right, so, it sounded like you just said that the grants can already be used for capital projects like this. So why do we need the bill?
I asked the same question. So apparently, the original intent just never got put into the regulations, and I believe there are people here who might be more expert on this than I, but that's my understanding, that somehow the language just got left off the list. It's actually encoded.
Zach Robbins, Department of Education. The existing statute limits the expenditures to security equipment. And what the delegate was referring to with the tax-exempt bond status, the requirements to use the tax-exempt bond proceeds are set by the federal law. It has to be on capital, and that was what the question was that we were working with the delegate on.
Just a quick question with regard to the wording of the definition of security equipment. And so I guess my concern is because it says for the purposes of this section, security equipment includes building modification and fixtures. So I guess depending on how you're reading it, you can or say security equipment also includes? I just wanna make sure it's more inclusive and that you're not accidentally narrowing the definition.
Also need to take a look at the Appropriation Act language that governs this program as well. That may be where the conflict is coming in.
But it's just that for security equipment, I don't normally think of like a vestibule or something like that, so it sounds to me like you're trying to modify it. I just wanna make sure that that's clear in the way that this is written.
Mr. Chairman, Tom Smith, Superintendent Association, we're in support of this bill. Coming, as you saw, many of the recommendations coming out of the House Select Committee, we're looking at how to renovate or how to change existing buildings. This would be another tool for the school division.
Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, Kathy Birch with Virginia Education Association, we support this bill and the flexibility allowed for our school divisions to do some of this maintenance work using these funds.
Mr. Chairman, Stacey Haney Sports Association, we also support the bill for the reasons stated.
Mr. Chairman, Jeremy Bennett, FACO, we support the bill for the reasons stated and the local flexibility.
There's one more.
Well, I just have a question. So you guys passed a bill similar to this at a full committee this morning. How did the two work together? I guess that's the question.
I don't remember that.
I don't know, sir. Do you have a bill number?
Yes, it was Delegate Rush's bill.
That was software.
House Bill 1739, very similar, just security equipment includes software and mobile applications. Don't see any harm for some.
Mr. Chairman, may I ask a question? So it was a different category that got added, so we're just saying possibly merge and add two categories?
Anyone else wish to speak to the bill? Any further discussion from the subcommittee? I have a motion and a second to recommend reporting the bill. Any other discussion or comment? Hearing none, please cast your vote. The motion passes 8-0.
Thank you.
Delegate Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First, I have a amendment in nature of a substitute.
We didn't make that many comments. We didn't make that many comments.
We have a motion to accept the substitute, please.
Thank you.
Without objection, substitute report.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, about a year ago, when we were in session, we got a call from some concerned parents and a picture which ultimately resulted in several newspaper stories about a lovely young lady named Gigi. And this young lady is actually put in a makeshift seclusion area in a school. They had taken several metal file cabinets and formed a barrier, and she was actually hanging over one of these file cabinets. We're very fortunate she wasn't injured. One of the children who was in the classroom had an iPad they were using for educational purposes and was able to take a picture. And we found out about this practice, which unfortunately has gone on, seclusion, and the other part, restraint, for quite a long time. I know you, Mr. Chairman, have done good work on this. The Department of Education has worked on in reaction to a bill that was passed several years ago to form guidelines on seclusion and restraint. I have those guidelines here. They're actually out for public comment. So I amended my bill, which originally was a little bit far-reaching, but in working with all the stakeholders, many of the things that I was trying to accomplish
are actually in these guidelines that are getting ready to come out. The two things that I actually wanted to address that were not in there in this pretty simple bill is number one,